I have a very distinct memory, and it's of me running out of a Waterstones with these three books and rushing back to my dad's van where he waited. And he looked at them, said, "Well, as long as you're enjoying them." These were the last three in the Banned and the Banished series. And I really want to talk about these today. Also, side note, being a reader as a kid was like a cheat code because if you wanted a DVD or a video game, that was a bit harder to get hold of, or even if you had your own money, there was a bit more judgment to it. But you could buy as many books as you want, or at least that was my experience. I think my dad always sort of like frowned when I was spending too much money, but I was, as he said, I was clearly enjoying these. I loved these books. These were my favourite fantasy series, and I never knew anyone else who read them. So I think this is a little bit of a therapy session, might be a bit too hard of a word, but this is me getting out a lot of thoughts that have been in my head for a while. But this was also me revisiting this series. That memory was from the mid 2000s, and I was probably, I don't know, 15, 16 at the time, maybe a bit younger, maybe a bit older, I'm not sure. But I was definitely a teenager. And I wanted to see how I thought of these books now. And interestingly, there was one thing in these books, that I had an issue with then. So I wanted to see how much more of an issue that was now. Let's discuss The Banned and the Banished by James Clemens. So this is the point where I cut to voiceover Emma to explain the general plot of the books. Quick side note, there's not going to be huge spoilers, but in order to discuss the things that I want to discuss, I will be giving away some things for later in the books. The Banned and the Banished, or as I like to call them, those fantasy books that like to put apostrophes in weird places, is a take on the Chosen One genre. Main character Eleanor comes into a special power when she hits her first bleed. Her hand turns bright red, and from it she can use a sort of fire magic. As she uses the magic, the colour of her hand fades until she needs to recharge it again by letting her hand get sunlight. This power grows and evolves over the course of the books. It turns out this power used to belong to a group of people centuries ago, but back then they were all men, and the one known woman to have it was labelled a witch, something to be feared. When Eleanor comes into this power, she is immediately hunted by agents of the Dark Lord, and thus begins the story. Meanwhile, while Eleanor and her brother are dealing with the scary people attacking her home, in the nearby town there is a one-armed man named Errol, who is in the middle of meeting a Nephi and a... Nephi? We'll go with Nephi. And a mountain man, and they all soon find themselves attempting to help Eleanor once she reaches the town. Errol is one of the more important members of the cast. He is immortal and has lived long enough that he actually had a brother with the magic known as Chi. Sort of the same thing that Eleanor has, but not quite. He is the gruff loner archetype who takes on the role of Eleanor's protector and guide for the group. These books have a fairly large cast, so I'll just run through some key players. Tolchuk, a half-ogre banished from his home and tasked with lifting a curse. A pair of shapeshifter brothers with a curse of their own. They are currently stuck in the forms of a man and wolf. An elven who believes Eleanor is a long-lost descendant of their royal family. A girl who is one of the Mirai who live in the sea and have partner sea dragons. A man with a hawk tattoo who becomes her partner and becomes possessed by the spirit of an ancient dragon. Then on the antagonist side, we have a straight up Dark Lord and his right-hand man. One of these being a man familiar with Eric, who has also gained the ability of immortality, but not the magic of eternal youth, which he is a bit bitter about. The series starts with Eleanor running away, getting to know these people who slowly, for one reason or another, become her protectors, and Errol becomes her guide to find the blood diary, and this becomes the drive for a couple of the books. I am keeping things general here just to avoid spoiling everything for you. There will be some condensing of the plot and the discussions, because my goal here is to really give you a feel for the book and let me revisit a series that I really enjoyed. And to do that, I'm going to go through the good and the bad, or at least this is down to my taste, what I think is good. So let's start with the good. Bear in mind, some of these are just what I like in a fantasy. It might not be your bag. Like the first one, multiple fantasy races. I love when fantasy has everything thrown in there. I'd also like a simple, clean fantasy. A lot of the fantasies we get at the moment, like Gentleman Master series and like the Emberblade that I just read. Books that are very pared down and character focused. That's not to say that these aren't character focused, which we'll come back to. But I do like when a fantasy is filled with fantasy. These books, they have humans and they have a lot of... They're given their own names, all with the crazy apostrophe in the middle. You have elven, Nephi, ogres, Mirai, mountain people, which are like distinct from humans, I think, in that weird sort of fantasy way. You have dwarves. Then that covers the main ones. But I like a series that has all of these elements. And as I said, this is a group ensemble cast. And we generally have a bit of everything in there. We have the Shapeshifter brothers. We have the Ogre Tolchuk, who is lovely. We have a couple of humans. But we have all of these types of fantasy races. With a lot of those come their own sort of brand of elemental magic. So the Elven are known for managing the winds, and Nephi can grow things, and the mountain people have this connection to rock and earth. And all of that is like depth to this incredible world that I love. Yes, I like something like Emberblade where it can be straightforward and political, but sometimes I'm just really in the mood for something with a lot of magic and variety. Next on the list, and again, this is completely to do with taste, but this is James Clement's ability to do horror. So another strong memory I have of reading the series is trying to read through the first one while I was homesick. And I had to stop reading because the descriptions were so vivid, they were making me feel more ill. I mean, that's just sad times, isn't it, when you're off sick? So one thing you get to do, and James Clemens just had to stop me in my tracks there. But he has these like Lovecraftian monsters, and things can get quite gory and gross and horrible. But these things really stick in your mind. Like in the second one, there's these like enemies who have elemental magic, but they've basically been turned bad by the bad guys. So it's sort of elemental magic gone wrong. Or at least it's like they're using that power to then create something new. But anyway, they come across one of these people that's been afflicted, and it's a woman who is... This might just turn you off straight away, but it is a woman who is a kind of mother to a swarm of spiders. And when she needs to travel and keep some of them safe, say when a forest is on fire and she has to escape, she can call those spiders back up her cooch, whatever word you like to use. Yeah, up there. Yeah, she keeps them up there. Yeah. And as a teenager, that is a heck of a strong image to stick with. So for me, I really like my horror. So this just like added to the depth, I guess, and of the experience of these books. If that's not your thing, fair enough. So the next good point is that these books have a large cast of female characters. And considering that the series started in the tail end of the 90s, that's still something that's pretty impressive. And in fact, I'd say that the number of women and the variety actually isn't always outdone even now. So you have Eleanor, the main character, and it's great that she gets the spotlight. But you also have the nymph-like woman helping her, who's like quite timid and airy-fairy, but then later on you have a big warrior woman who is a mother, but a mother who abandoned her child. You have the crazy spider woman. You have another teenage girl later on who is Eleanor-ish, but she definitely still has her own personality. And so reading these as a teenage girl was fantastic. I actually had so many characters that I could sort of look up to, and it really was a variety cast. It never really felt like, the boys were overrunning everything. And there's this old dwarf woman who's like linked to a swamp, so she's got lots of magic, but she's sort of trapped in not trapped in the swamp, but like that's where she gives and takes energy with the swamp. And I'm not explaining that very well. She's like this weird looking old dwarf who's lived for like way longer than she should have. But she is a cool character. I really like her. And that brings me to the fact that there is just a large variety of characters in general. The cast is huge, but you never get too lost with it. After a while, the books start to be structured in a way where you kind of stick with one group for a while as people kind of split off. So I never found it too confusing. You have all of these really clear personalities. I mentioned the Ogre Toadhook, who is really sweet, and he's been sort of like beaten down in his past, but he is always out to do the right thing. You have the two shapeshifter brothers, where one of them, I feel like if he wasn't a wolf or in the shape of a wolf for... I'm trying to avoid spoilers here, but if he wasn't in the shape of a wolf for these books, I feel like he would be swoon material, because he always seems to come in and save the day, but he doesn't necessarily get to say anything, or at least not in a conventional sense. Shapeshifters have this sort of like telepathy through pictures and images, but his twin brother is the absolute worst. He is perfectly happy to throw people under the bus if it means getting what he wants. Like, what he wants is like so important. But he's like with the main group for so long that everyone trusts him and they don't think he's going to do anything. So yeah, this causes a lot of tension when you're like, oh no, he's going to screw them over. Oh no, and they just like think he's helping them, and no. But like I said with the elemental magic, it means you get this great variety of ideas and concepts, like the image telepathy. It just means that there's always something new and interesting to discover, and new characters to enjoy, as the roster grows. You're either going to find a new character to love, or, a new villain to hate, or, a morally grey person to worry about. And I think that's one of my favourite things about these books. I know some people worry about giant rosters, but it really doesn't feel like it's too over the top until it gets a bit later on with one of the issues, but I will wait until the bad list to talk about that. So one brief one that I probably should have tagged on the end of the horror section is that there are a surprising number of grimdark-ish elements to this as well. You have characters that have committed suicide, and I phrase it like that because of the nature of magic, people can sort of be brought back and enslaved by the Dark Lord. So you can have this magical villain, but he's got like empty memories and he can't remember what he was before, and then he slowly comes to this realization. You have people who've lost infants and children. It doesn't really sit in those moments for too long, but it's definitely not afraid to look at them every once in a while, just to really show how rough and hard the situation is and this world that they all live in. And I think the darker tone really complements the story that is happening here. Next is a hard-ish magic system. I say this because there are definitely rules for how certain magics work, like Eleanor's magic. So her hand charges from the sun, she lifts it to the sun and it goes bright red, and as she goes through her magic, the colour fades, and once it's back to skin colour, then that magic is gone. And if it's nighttime or they're stuck in a cave where they can't access light, there's nothing she can do about it. Her battery is dead and there is nothing that can be done. So you do get these great limitations in situations where it doesn't feel like they're going to quickly cheat their way out of things. Having said that, the reason why it's hard-ish is because you get introduced to new types of magic fairly regularly, especially with like the elemental stuff. So to some people it might feel like a little bit of a cheat when a new magic appears. It never feels like it makes things easy. I guess sometimes it's a surprise that can win a fight, but it always feels like there's a cost to things. And last on the good list, and again, this is purely taste, and that is the presence of a Dark Lord. Why is this in the good? Well, I think it's just because sometimes I'm in the mood for something like that. Don't get me wrong, again, I love my serious, straightforward political stuff, or a series that's just about morally grey characters and worlds, but every so often I just need a simple good versus evil story. Especially because I feel like cinema and films over the last sort of like decade or two have slowly shifted or have been pressured to be more complex, which is fine. But sometimes I watch a show and I just think, you know what? I actually think this would be so much better if it just had like a straightforward evil villain. You know, I want Jim Carrey as Dr. Robotnik, and you know, that's what I want sometimes. Not that the Dark Lord is not like Jim Carrey. And for the most part, he is very much Lord of the Rings inspired. He's Sauron-esque. He is in the shadows, and most of the villains that we deal with are his like right-hand men. You know, very powerful figures. But I sometimes I like the simplicity of we need to defeat this guy. You might not be in the mood for it all the time, but sometimes you need it. Okay, time to hydrate, because now we're going to get into it. Let's look at the bad. This is going to cover some topics that I have wanted to discuss with people for a long time, because there's some interesting decisions made in this book. Let's have a look at them. First, and I'm kind of putting in this first because it's a bit of a mixed thing, and that is the use of bleeding. I'm just going to say periods. So the use of periods. Eleanor gets her power when she has her first period. There's a whole sort of like lore about, you know, first bleed leads to first blood, something like that. In other words, once you have your first bleeds, then you're going to get that magical connection. Which, as a premise, I actually think is pretty cool. I think it's quite common in SFF. Yeah, in SFF books and stories for a child, if they've got a natural ability for that to come about in puberty. But linking it specifically to a period, I think is pretty cool. And again, I wasn't seeing any other media talk about or mention periods. So it started off as being quite cool. Then it gets weird, because after that first moment, we're not really shown any other instances of her just having her period. I know that this is something that kind of has been discussed before, and some people will kind of say it's like going to the toilet. You're not always going to show a character doing these things because it's not necessarily interesting. But I think when that's your setup, I actually think it would have been interesting to see how she was the second time. You know, maybe bring up that it is affecting her ability to travel with everyone. Maybe she's anxious about getting her second one because of how horrible the first one was. I mean, her parents die, and her house, and she has to leave her home, and her house is on fire. That, you know, imagine if that's how your first period goes. You're gonna be a bit freaked out after that. So I think if that's the setup, it would have been interesting to see her going through that later. And, you know, there is another female character with her. I don't know if the Nephi have periods. It's an interesting question. But she could have had that, you know, woman-to-woman conversation. And sadly that doesn't really happen. Which is a bit of a shame. And And also, it's not in this book, but there's another character. Do I bring this up now, or do I bring it up in a sec? And on top of that, there's a Mirai, so that's this world's sort of mermaid-ish, like seafaring. Is that even the right word? Is it seafaring if you live under the sea? The sea. Basically, she's a sea person. And then there's a whole plot where she gets her first period and shit goes crazy again. And I'll come back around to that because there's other reasons why that becomes quite weird and a bit icky. Now, if you've been listening closely, the next one might not be a surprise, and that is Repetition. It's 5 books in the series, and once you get to 3, 4, and 5, you notice some things start to repeat themselves. I think it's quite common for authors to want to revisit the same ideas. I don't think there's anything wrong in that, and I think it can be quite great when a creator goes, you know what, I want to have another go because I feel like I can do it better now. But when that happens in the same series, it's a little bit jarring. For example, a character who is part of the main team dies, and then they somehow come back to life, but in a slightly different form. They've come back changed. Then in another book, a character dies, and then a book later, they come back to life in a different form. And like I said with the last topic, Helena has her first period, and shit goes crazy. The mermaid girl has her first period. Shit goes crazy. So you just have to feel that things are happening again, like he's using the same story points. And this is something I actually picked up on when I was a teenager. Like, maybe I'm being a bit picky. It doesn't happen a huge amount, but I think because it happens with, like, it's quite key things that are happening twice, it's just quite odd. And that is actually relevant for the final point and the most serious topic of the lot. Slywen, that's the name of the mermaid-ish girl. So the last topic is young girls having relationships or falling into relationships with much older men. And I want to give some context here. So, Eleanor is this chosen one archetype. She has all of these powers. And she's our main hero, but that means that she goes through a lot. At the start of the series, Eleanor is 14. And the span of the series, I suppose, takes a couple of years. It's not 100% clear. So she'll be about 16, 17 by the end. 17 at the most. I think she's probably 16. And in one of the books, something happens where a magical object steals years off her. So she ages by about 5 years in the span of seconds. She grows taller, her hair grows out, her nails grow out, her physical body transforms into that of an older woman. So essentially, it's a quick fast forward to a mature woman's body. And on top of that, over the course of the books, she kind of does grow into more of a mature figure. You know, she's in charge of actual armies and deciding how to face certain battles. You know, and people have a lot of respect for her towards the end. Now, I'm telling you this because I think the book really wants you to bear this in mind. When she asks Errol, her older guardian, to sleep with her. So put a pin in that, and we'll looking at Errol. Errol is a character who, I don't know how old he's supposed to be when the spell happens. Let's say he's in his 30s when a spell stops him from aging. So he's been around for a century at least, not aging. And again, the book wants you to kind of think he's a man who's been stuck in time, and she's a woman who's been fast forwarded to womanhood and has done more growing in 2 years than he's done in 100. Bullshit. One thing in his favour, Errol does say no to begin with, and then Eleanor lays these arguments at his feet. And eventually, yes, the deed is done. And weirdly, the blood thing comes into it again, because there's a whole virginal blood aspect, and then means she can use some magic when she needs. Oh. So I hope I don't need to explain why this is kind of messed up, but I'm gonna go over some things anyway. Eleanor is 14 when she meets Errol. She is still a kid, and he is very much an adult who has been around for a very, very long time. You know, he's not just technically an adult, he is a grown man who's been around for a long time, and is then given the role of guardian. He then essentially becomes the closest thing she has to a father figure. Not that the book treats it that way, but oh my god, if that's the person who's looking after you when you're a young teenager and there's no one else, that is what it is. And I don't think the trope of aging her up like that makes it okay. She's still a 16-year-old, even if she doesn't look it. You know, her mind hasn't suddenly had 5 years of experiences, because that's what a lot of growing up is. It's gaining those experiences of life. And it doesn't matter how much the younger person asks or begs for something like this to happen, the responsibility is with the adult to say no, and to keep saying no. So yeah, it's a very serious topic. And I think with all of the explanations that the book gives, and the fact that, you know, this was still late 90s, early 2000s, so you can put it down to an era of, you know, we've not quite learned our lessons yet, unfortunately. So I think if that was the only case, I could forgive it a little bit, but it's not the only case. remember when I explained the period thing for the mermaid girl, Siwen? So she's in this cave where this ancient dragon has been slumbering in stone for millennia or whatever, and she gets her first period. Now, there's a weird thing with the Mirai where they essentially partner with a dragon, a sea dragon, for life. And it's usually I think this is the case for all of them, but it's the period blood that will attract a dragon to them, if they're a woman anyway. So she's in the cave, she has her first period, and the dragon awakens and she bonds with this ancient dragon. Very cool that she gets to bond with an ancient dragon. But there's also some shenanigans that means the dragon ends up possessing, I think is the best word, ends up possessing another character. Oh my god, what's his name? Cast. So the dragon ends up possessing Cast. And Cast is again, an older man. He's a sailor. He used to be part of this group of people who they basically just live on the sea. They sail the seas. They all have these, or at some point they used to have dragon tattoos, but he's got a eagle tattoo on his neck. And they all have these tattoos, and they have their own culture. And something's happened, and then he left them. And when we meet him, he's just part of another ship. So he's, I don't know, a random guy on a ship who comes across Siwen when something happens. I'm sorry, I'm really vague. She gets caught up in a ship, or her dragon gets caught. Her mum's... It's very complicated, this book series. Basically, so this older guy comes into the picture, and again, because of some weird ancient magics, when she touches the tattoo on his neck, it's like he becomes possessed, and he does whatever he asks, and instantly wants to protect her. This is because of some like ancient bond between her race and his race. So these characters are together when they go into the cave, and then the dragon possesses him, and it is a cool concept. It creates this odd sort of three-way partnership. So you have this dragon that kind of wants to protect her and sort of doesn't want to let Cast take over because he thinks that he should be enough. But obviously she needs Cast as well. But at some point, it's made very obvious that they are flirting and then starting a relationship. And this one annoys me because if we didn't have the whole dumb thing about her period, and she was aged up to be in her 20s already, then this could have been a really great relationship and character arc, because the way they're written is very sweet. They're very loving to each other, and they're also quite... First, they love being together and they love having sex with each other. A lot of that happens sort of like off camera, but it's made very clear that that's what they're doing and that they are in a full proper relationship. And this does mean that things hit harder when stuff happens later on in the books. But it just seems such a waste when you have this whole period story that clearly means that she is still really young. Like, I don't know if she's given a specific age, but I mean, I don't know how old mermaids are when they get their period, but some girls can have them, start them when they're 10. Some girls start them when they're 14. She could have started it when she's 16. Hell, even 18, and I don't even think this would be an age-appropriate relationship. So yeah, it sucks. And it was a huge... Weirdly, I think the Cywin one bothered me more on the reread for the reason that it could have been so much better if she was just aged up. Or the opposite, or if Cast actually wasn't another world-weary, Wolverine type. If he was a younger character who's confused about what's happening, there's no reason why he has to be an older guy. So yeah, it's a trope that I hate, and I really hope I don't see it in any modern books. Because it sucks. I hate it. And I think that covers everything. We've really gotten to the meat of what I wanted to cover. And it's a shame because could I recommend the series? I don't know is the answer. If you're someone who can take that in mind and say, hey, it's of an era, it's, people hadn't quite corrected themselves in the 90s, which just depresses me. But if you could take that in mind and the pluses and the good things appeal to you, go for it, have fun. Because I still enjoy so much of these books. There's so many cool characters and there is so much to love. And I think that's why like I said, I think that's why it annoys me. Because there's so much to enjoy in these. And it really sucks to have those things drag it down. So give a look or don't give a look. That's entirely up to you. But I'm quite happy to have revisited and potentially put to bed an old series. Don't know if I'll revisit it in the future. So for now, they're going to sit on my shelves to remind me of how James Clemens writes. If you've made it this far, I'm also going to tag on the fact that James Clemens wrote another series after this, and he wrote 2 of them and then stopped. I think the 3rd one's actually going to come out soon. Last time I googled it. But that series is kind of odd. Because there's a setup with gods who live in, cities and rule the city. But each god, because they're sacred, there's a thing with, humours. So there's someone responsible for, taking and storing each of the gods' humours. Yeah. James Clemens gets a bit gross, if you can't tell. That's just a little tidbit I thought I'd share. I've chatted for a long time, so I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.